here. And if you'll forgive me, I am going to read some notes from my computer. We're going to try to cut in a lot of information. I'm going to try to talk slowly. Can everybody in the back hear me?
Yeah.
All right. We do have a microphone, but I don't think I'll need it in here. So as Rowena said, this is West Campus, Evolution of an Austin Neighborhood. Make sure my pointer is working. Oh. I'm Susan Floyd, School of Information, UT Austin. And I want to thank the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the state of Texas, who own and operate the Neill-Cochran House Museum, both for making this museum such a great place here in Austin, for Austin and Texas history, making this available to us, and for putting on this exhibit and all their other programming that you just heard about. This is really a resource here in West Campus, and I hope those of you who haven't been here before will come back in the future or think about joining us as a friend and get involved in some of our programming. As Rowena said, I'm also a docent here sometimes when I can squeeze it in around my grad school. I'll probably be doing that some more this summer, so please come back or talk to me afterward if you want to go on a tour. I would love to tell you more about some of the stuff you saw around the building. And after the talk, I'm going to moderate a discussion about your memories of West Campus, or anything you'd like to address in the slides that we see, anything that's different from what you remember or looks familiar, nostalgia or otherwise. And then we're going to open the house up for another 20 or 30 minutes for more walkthrough if you want to get another drink. If you didn't get a chance to look around since it was pretty crowded tonight. I'm going to try to keep this to about 20 minutes, so I may go through some of the slides a little bit faster than others, monitoring the time here. So first I want to start with a question. How many of you think you know what West Campus is? Sounds familiar. You know what it is, right? How many people have lived in West Campus or live in West Campus? The vast majority of people, right? So what is West Campus? Oh, except one. Does this say West Campus to anybody? Or what about this guy? This?
Yeah.
Yeah? A little more familiar? What about her? A few people here will recognize her. What about that? Right? Or this? Is it appropriate today? It is the 179th anniversary of the Battle of San Jacinto. I want to point that out. It's a good day for Texas history presentation. That's West Campus, right? Looks familiar. Now, it's all of those things we just saw, including the ones that were surprising, and much more. But what has been here since 1855 in West Campus? Big hint. Yeah. This house, the Neill-Cochran house, has been here since 1855. It's one of the few things that's been here this whole time. But to really get a real context for what this means, we need to go back a little further, even further. Let's go back further. Yep, let's try that. 1815, 200 years ago. Of course, there was no photography in 1815, so this is the best I can do. This is a picture of the Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge, west of Austin. It's taken in 2009. And this kind of gives us an idea of what this area might have looked like before it was so extensively settled and developed. As you can see here, the hills rise from the creek below up to the flat-topped balconies for which the refuge is named. We get the word balcones from Spanish, from this natural topography. And the house here sits on a natural hill, which is one of many ridges between the gently sloping prairies of eastern Travis County going down to the coastal plain, and to the west, the hill country rises up higher. Sorry. Here's Shoal Creek. Many of you know, right? This looks pretty similar. The availability of water here was a key factor in the spread of human settlement to this area of Austin, from prehistory right up into the early 20th century. And Shoal Creek has its source northwest, about 10 miles northwest of here, in the North Shoal Creek neighborhood, as it's now known, and runs all the way down to the Colorado River. And a lot of it appears as it would have in the early 19th century. I'm sure if you've walked along the trail, there are a few places where you don't really see a lot of buildings, and it feels pretty rural, and it's a nice escape in the city. And you can get a pretty good idea for what it looks like naturally before all the development was here. A lot of it is similar, but the increase in human construction has changed it in a few ways, especially the paving of so many streets around the creek. That's resulted in greater amounts of runoff entering the creek during rains, which we haven't had a lot of lately, but it does happen occasionally. And of course, that causes flash floods. of Shoal Creek flooding in 1915, 100 years ago. So it's also been dangerous to the inhabitants of the area and a reminder of the power of nature amid all this development and human settlement and now density here in the urban area. There was even a flash flood in 1981, which some people may remember, was one of the most deadly, killed 13 people. It cost $30 million in property damage. So that was pretty recent. So it is still a force to be reckoned with. But the presence of water in the area meant it was also settled by some of the earliest inhabitants of what was now Austin. The archaeological record shows that there have been people here for at least 11,000 years, and they were probably settled right here around Shoal Creek and the other creeks in the area because of the water. We know very little about their daily life and culture, but the evidence suggests the population density was very low. They had come down following the edge of the Balcones escarpment, following herds of animals and looking for creeks. This is a picture from the Jordan Bachman Pioneer Farm in northeast Austin. I don't know if anybody has been there. Go check that out if you have a chance. They have a few installations like this showing what the area would have looked like at different points in Texas history. And this is a reconstruction of a Tonkawa Indian village on Walnut Creek. And most of the evidence they used to reconstruct this was taken from archaeological artifacts they found there on the site at Walnut Creek, which is pretty interesting. Right now they actually have an exhibit about the Tonkawa and showing a lot of arrowheads and other tools and things they found around the area. So we know that by 2000 BCE, these bands of nomads had developed specialized adaptations to our local environment here, and their culture was based mostly on hunting white-tailed deer and processing local acorns, food into various types of flowers. Recent excavations have also shown that they had far-reaching trade networks. There were a lot of cemeteries here, even several thousands of years ago. Some of those have been partially excavated, and they have found grave goods and jewelry from the Gulf Coast into Louisiana. So there were large trade networks, even many hundreds of years, thousands of years into the past. From about 1200 Common Era, coinciding with what historians believe was the peak bison population in North America, the inhabitants of this area here around Austin shifted from white-tailed deer and smaller game to hunting bison. So this probably looks pretty familiar. By 1700, they were consolidated into a group called the Tonkawa from a lot of smaller tribes and lived mostly in bison teepees, fairly short bison teepees around water and creeks. Tonkawa is from the Waco-Wichita language and means they all stayed together. This photo was also taken at the Jordan Bachman Pioneer Farm. There are several teepees. You can go inside them and look around. So, especially if you have any children, I encourage you to visit that as well. The Tonkawa elected a head tribal chief, and they had maternal clans. We know that their dress included buckskin and bison loincloths, leggings, moccasins, skirts for women, and robes in cold weather. And they all also wore bone, shell, and feather jewels and tattooed themselves with black stripes. Moving forward, this is a 19th century map of Spanish Texas. So I have a feeling from taking the pulse of the audience that we can all pretty much figure out what we're looking at here, right? There we go. We're around there somewhere in the Tonkawa lands. And you can see it does say Tonkawa is there in the middle. I'm gonna, even though it's San Jacinto Day, I'm gonna kind of skip over the Texas Revolution a little bit, except for where it impacts our narrative here. As I'm sure most of you know, Texas achieved its independence from Mexico in 1836. In 1837, the village of Waterloo was founded here at the convergence of the Colorado River and Shoal Creek, so just a couple miles down the creek here. It's the first documented permanent settlement in this area of what is currently Austin. But during this post-revolutionary period in Texas, things were kind of in political chaos. There was a lot of argument about whether the capital should be further east, away from not only the Tonkawa, but the Comanche, who mostly lived a little bit to the northwest of here, and closer to more established trade routes, particularly around Houston and Galveston, which are already significant ports at that time. After his election in 1838, though, the president of the Republic, Mirabeau B. Lamar, had a new government. He really wanted the capital to be here because he knew that eventually this would be the center of Texas. And so he purchased nearly 8,000 acres, or he had the government purchase 8,000 acres along the Colorado River, including Waterloo and the surrounding lands, which included a lot of the traditional Tonkawa lands. They were still here at the time, but their tribes had been diminished by diseases and raids from the Apache and Comanche. In 1839, the city was renamed Austin after Stephen F. Austin, who we all know as the father of Texas, and received its charter as the capital of the Republic of Texas. President Lamar then appointed Judge Edwin Waller to design this plan for the original city of Austin in 1839. Let's see if my animation works. He sited the Capitol building on a bluff overlooking the Colorado River, which is where the Capitol is today, between Shoal Creek to the west and Waller Creek on the east, named after Edwin Waller, who designed the city plan. As capital of the new republic, Austin grew and construction increased. By 1845, when Texas was annexed by treaty to the United States, it was pretty well decided that the capital would remain here. There was a little more back and forth between the Lamar and Houston factions in the 1840s. But Austin was settled as the capital and has remained the capital ever since. Now, finally, into the 1850s. By 1850, there were 854 people living in Austin. 225 of them were slaves. By then, the state government had begun to construct the first truly permanent buildings, including a new limestone state capitol, which was completed in 1853, the governor's mansion, and the Neill-Cochran house, completed in 1856. The governor's mansion and the Neill-Cochran house, both built by Abner Cook, who's known as a master builder. If you come back on the tour another time, I'll tell you all about him. We're going to briefly talk about him today. He built a series of sophisticated Greek Revival mansions and other buildings throughout the city and its outskirts. This building, known as the Neill-Cochran house, was originally the Hill House after its builders, Washington and Mary Hill. This picture is a bit after the 1850s, but you can get an idea of how isolated this area was, and that there's no paving or even street earlier in the building's history. You're back here. So the recorded history of this area of West Campus begins in 1855, when Washington and Mary Hill purchased 7.5 acres. They signed 2 mortgages totaling nearly $5,000 and sold their 5 slaves for $2,000, all to help pay for the construction of the house. Washington Hill's job as a land agent and surveyor probably required a lot of travel, and his wife Mary was uncomfortable living alone on what was then a pretty remote area in the frontier. We're a good mile northwest of the capital, and most of Austin, which was already very small, was between the capital and the Colorado River at that time. So it was very much outside the city of Austin. And the likelihood of Comanche attack had probably diminished during the 1840s, but it was still pretty remote, and there were still Tonkawa living in the area at this time. So the Hills never moved in, probably due to the financial strain caused by the construction of this house. However, in 1856, they did manage to acquire an additional adjacent 10 acres, bringing the total area of this property to 17.5 acres when they sold it to 2 local businessmen, Swante Magnus Swenson and John Milton Swisher. Always a tongue tire, right? Swenson and Swisher, in turn, rented the house to the Board of Trustees of the Institution for the Education of the Blind for $75 a month, while their permanent school for the blind was under construction, also being built by Abner Cook. Back to the sky, this is Chief Centelle, also known as Grant Richards. This is a studio portrait by Frank Reinhardt, taken at the U.S. Indian Congress and International Exposition in Omaha, Nebraska in 1898. Now, it's been hard for me to find a lot of photographs representing the Tonkawa, or the indigenous culture in this area. But this picture is very interesting and important because it's a studio portrait taken by a very capable photographer, and is one of the only and last photos of a Tonkawa tribe person at the time. So there are a few others available on Wiki Commons and through the Boston Public Library. It's very interesting if you read about it, but there's not a lot of other information provided. We do know that more than 500 Native Americans from 35 tribes attended this conference, and a lot of them got their photos taken while they were there. Now, in 1859, after a series of raids by various tribes, including the Tonkawa, angry Anglos started to attack the Indians. Then they were put onto a reservation. Between all of this strife, a lot of the Indians had died, and there weren't very many Tonkawa left in the area. Then they were removed to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma by the federal government. By the early 20th century, they intermarried with the local Apache and whites in Oklahoma to the point that they no longer had a separate, distinguishable culture. So this represents one of the last moments that we could encounter a Tonkawa. I just feel like that's important to note here because we don't think about who was here for these 11,000 years very often. Next. There's kind of a blank from 1860 to 1863. The historical record doesn't say what happened here at the Hill House during the first years of the Civil War, so it was probably empty. But in 1863, Swenson and Swisher contracted a rent-to-own agreement with the Lieutenant Governor of the Confederate State of Texas, Fletcher Stockdale. So he was here from 1863 to 1865, and he was paying $900 a year rent. We think that he had a contract to rent the house for 10 years, but we don't know when he moved out. There's no record of the end of his residence here. And because he was renting to own, presumably when he stopped paying the rent, his contract was voided. The war ended in the spring of 1865, and that November, the Federal Army came to Austin and took control of the house. Now, does anyone recognize this guy? Yes. Yes, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer arrived in Austin on November 9, 1865, to briefly, for about a year, take command of the Texas Military District. He was involved in requisitioning 2 Abner Cook structures. He moved his family and staff into the Asylum for the Blind, which, as one of our visitors noted, is now part of the UT campus over at 35 at MLK near the Irwin Center. And there are actually photos of Custer and some of his staff there on the steps of that house. And then he requisitioned the Neill-Cochran house, then the Hill House, for use as a federal war hospital. We know that the primary patients were most likely federal soldiers who were stationed down on Shoal Creek, where there was a yellow fever epidemic. So they probably came here because this was a pretty well isolated area for them to recover and made sense as a hospital. And there's actually a historical marker down there on Shoal Creek today about Custer's army. You can go find it. He left in 1866 to be replaced by General Philip Sheridan, and the Hill House continued to function as a hospital into 1867. Now, Custer initially promised to pay rent to Swisher and Swenson, who were still the owners, but when Swenson's Austin agent, James Raymond, attempted to collect the rent for the requisition, Custer refused. Raymond